Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for welcoming me back here. There are a few things that I do in this state that I'm very, very proud of. Obviously, one of them is being on the radio, but one of them is the Connecticut Forum, which is a unique conversation in front of a large number of people, and getting people to come out in Hartford to sit and listen to people talk is not an easy thing, but they do it. But the other thing is this event right here. There's truly nothing like the International Festival of Arts and Ideas anywhere else, and I think that you should give one more quick round of applause to everyone in this building, in this room, who helps to make it possible, because it is a very special thing. So the last couple of years I've been here, we've talked about one of the other topic areas that I cover extensively, which is energy and the environment, and obviously I'm very passionate about covering those issues. But I was thrilled that we were going to be talking about citizenship and the idea of what it means to be an American, and it gave us an opportunity to talk about some of our reporting in immigration over the course of the last few years across the region. One of the biggest political debates, of course, about immigration is that it hurts the chances of American-born workers to succeed, and some say it damages the U.S. economy. Here in New England, of course, the population is rapidly aging, and the young replacement workers needed to sustain that workforce, they're leaving, and so immigration might just provide our best opportunity. That's one of the theories we've worked on as we've created a project called Facing Change that's mapping demographic change across New England and immigration issues in our region as well. So before we introduce some of our guests, I just want to take you through a couple of slides here. I'm an audio guy, I'm not a video guy, so hopefully this goes right. But I just want to show you a little bit about what we mean when we say immigrants in New England. So immigrants make up about the same amount of New England as they do of the U.S. It's not a big surprise to you probably that Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the southern New England states, have a higher percentage of immigrant population than the northern New England states, which are very, very predominantly white. However, as we'll see later, some things are changing in places like Lewiston, Maine. So where are these populations exactly? Well, you can see it once again. They're pocketed in these southern New England regions in the more urban areas, but you see more pockets developing in and around that Connecticut River Valley corridor that's anchored by Dartmouth University, up and around Burlington, Vermont, and certainly in down East Maine. This is something that's been changing over time. As you look at the share, though, on the lower corner, you still see that much of New England has a very small share of immigrant population. What that means is that when people come into regions, they're often creating tension because they're the first people who look like them, talk like them, sound like them that have ever been in some communities. And so those are some of the tensions we've been covering as well. New England is home to immigrants from all over the world. This just gives you a brief graphical representation. You'll see the little circle just above the United States. That's 73, and this is in thousands, 73,000 Canadians live in our region right now. I don't know if you know very much about Canada. It's clearly, according to the president, a very, very difficult place that causes us a lot of problems. So hopefully we're going to learn more about Canada and some of the problems coming from across the border there. But you're also going to see that we are spread around the world. And that's one thing that I think is pretty interesting. You see this, but you also see a lot of people who are from some very specific places that make up most of the immigration to our region. So the surges in recent decades are pretty obvious. From 2000 to 2009, a pretty enormous surge in immigrants to our region, and a larger percentage of immigrants in the last 2 decades coming from Asia and certainly Central America and the Caribbean. If you look all the way to the left of that graph, you'll see the immigration boom before 1970, which is made up of people from Europe. These are the immigrants that we know from places like New Haven and Middletown and Hartford and Stamford and all over Connecticut. it has changed a bit over time, and that's created some of the tensions that we see as the people who came here before 1970 are learning to live with the people who are coming here from other parts of the world since then. So my guest, Ahmed Mushfiq Mobarak, is a professor of economics at Yale University. He's a member of the Jameel Poverty Action Lab's board of directors at MIT. He's co-chair of its Urban Services Initiative and of its environment and energy sector work. He's also lead academic for the International Growth Center's Bangladesh Research Program. He's a scientific advisor to Innovations for Poverty Action in Bangladesh. He's going to present us a lot of big ideas about immigration and the economy. But before I welcome him up, let's listen to a little bit of some of his ideas in this video.
Professor of Economics at the Yale School of Management. I want to tell you about the logic behind the economic benefits of migration and outline 6 ideas that come out of the empirical research on this subject. Each of these points is backed up by rigorous studies. Here's how a lot of people think about immigration. A migrant worker comes in and takes a job away from a native worker. There are a lot of mistakes in this picture, according to the economists who have studied migration. First, the story would be that simple only if an immigrant substitutes for a native worker perfectly. In reality, migrants often take jobs natives don't want. And immigrants are more likely to move into sectors where language skills and customer or client-facing skills are not as important. In other words, natives with such skills are not easily displaced. In the case of agriculture, for instance, migrant workers literally keep fruits from rotting on the ground. In some cases, migrant labor can even be a complement to natives. That's an economist's way of saying that migration can create more jobs than existed before. Picture a busy restaurant. Orders flying into the kitchen, dishes flying out to diners, and then back to the sink. Now imagine migrant labor makes it easier for the business owner to find cheap dishwashers. The business does better, it expands and brings in more waiters and managers. Think about this. There are 168 hours in each week, and you have a certain number of things that you just have to get done. You have to work, care for your children, mow the lawn, maintain your car and home. What would you do if someone took one of those chores off your hands? Okay, you might just play more PlayStation, but not everyone is like that. Many migrants provide services like lawn mowing and babysitting, lowering those costs and freeing time for workers to be more productive. Important point. Innovation makes our economy grow. Highly skilled migrants create scientific breakthroughs and other improvements. Foreign-born scientists and engineers resident in the US create many of these innovations. The typical Nobel Prize winner is affiliated with a US university, but was not born in the United States. These innovations result in new products and markets. Most new jobs are created by new and growing businesses. Who creates the businesses that create these jobs? Here are just a few of the companies that were founded by immigrants to the US. You might have heard of some of them. This fact isn't so surprising if you think about who immigrants are. Who leaves their home to strike out for a distant land? Someone with ambition and gumption. And who can successfully navigate all the challenges of such a move? Someone with intelligence and grit. Again, the economists have a term for this. It's called selectivity. While immigration will certainly create challenges for some individuals, the research is clear that overall it drives economic growth and creates more winners and losers in the receiving countries.
Let me welcome up Mushfiq Mobarak. It's a fun video, and you pack an awful lot in there, but there's a lot more to talk about. So let's go through some of it. First of all, thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to ask you first about this idea of immigration affecting native-born workers. despite what you say, there is a feeling that if people come from elsewhere, that it is going to naturally negatively impact the availability of jobs for native-born Americans. To talk a bit more through the research that you've done about that and that you've seen about that.
Okay, so that was actually the impetus for creating this video, because it's not only among laymen, but also among trained economists. Even some of my colleagues who I won't name, where this is the natural reaction, which is, you observe a foreign-born worker coming in and taking a job, and your natural reaction is, the simplest explanation here is that this is a job that would have gone to an American-born worker had it not been for the foreign, right? But it turns out that when you look at the data very, very carefully, the story is not that simple. Okay? And so there is a set of people who are harmed, a subset of people in the US economy who are harmed by influx of foreigners, and that's actually going to be the previous generations of foreigners, the recent immigrants. Okay?
So that's going to be recent immigrants are going to be more hurt. Why is that?
Yeah, because of the,
I'm just going to quickly, I'm going to ask you, maybe you can just take that out of there.
Okay.
We're having a little bit of an issue, and we'll just, you can do it,
Perfect.
Madonna style.
Okay, perfect. So, and the reason, and the logic behind that is to think about who's substitutes for immigrant workers. So when an immigrant worker comes in, they'll of course take up some jobs, right? And they're going to take up jobs from the people that they can easily substitute away. So for example, if there's a client-facing job that requires the good language skills, good social interaction skills, in the sense of, by social interaction I mean understanding US culture and being able to communicate with clients, with customers, etc., right? Those jobs are not easily taken up by recent immigrants, right? And American workers are not easily displaced because they have a set of special skills that it takes a while for people to replicate. You hear my accent now. I arrived from Bangladesh about 20 years ago. This wasn't my accent when I arrived. And so it wasn't, and I also did not understand American humor or culture, and it would be very difficult for me, for example, to talk to you. So whereas, so what are the types of jobs that immigrants go into? Well, okay, who are the closest substitutes? Is going to be the previous generation of immigrants. So when people have looked at this data carefully, and by the way, all the animation that I had here was my way of trying to communicate concisely and clearly about what the research shows, but each of those points are not just anecdotes. They're based on hundreds of studies with hundreds of thousands of data points. Okay? And and the research very clearly shows that yes, there is going to be some wage effect. The negative wage effect is mostly on recent generation of immigrants, and overall for Americans who are not easily substituted away, there are no detectable negative or adverse wage effects for them.
So some of the pushback to this, there are some researchers, George Borjas at Harvard has written that the wages of low-skilled American workers have dropped as a result of the growing numbers of low-skilled workers. Basically, more people in that job classification, immigrant or not, means that it's going to drive down the wages for the workers who are already here.
That's right. So the way to think about Borjas's work relative to, say, what Giovanni Perry, who's at UC San Diego, finds, looking at a lot of similar data, and that's some of the research that I highlighted, is again it boils down to, without going into the details of the economic models, is how substitutable are immigrant versus native workers, right? And Borjas and Perry just makes less of a kind of stringent assumption on how substitutable they are, and he finds different results. And now, of course, this gets into the business of he said, she said, or he said and he said, as it's
which is what happens with economists mostly.
Exactly.
Yes, I know.
So then, so at that point, what do we do in science in order to push forward? We do meta-analysis, right? So we take lots and lots of studies, including Borjas, including Perry's, as well as about 80 other studies that have examined this question, right? And then we look at the full range of estimates and try to get a sense of what does the data tell us on average or at the median, right? And there, so this is an important enough issue that the National Academy of Sciences, about every 10, 15 years, has done a big review. So the most recent one was done about 3 or 4 years ago, and it reviewed about 600 studies on immigration, right? And Borjas was on that panel, And the panel's findings was, even accounting for Borjas' studies and others, what we find is that if there are maybe some negative wage effects concentrated on past immigrants, and on average for American native-born workers, there's no detectable negative effects.
So there's the jobs, whether or not there are jobs available in different classifications for American-born workers. There's the wages of workers, both American-born and foreign-born. And then there's the overall impact to the U.S. economy, which is a kind of an abstract thing in certain ways. Many people, through the economic crisis of a decade ago, were still doing just fine. Many other people's lives collapsed. I guess I'm wondering, if you talk about the economy as a whole, what do we see as the impact of this increasing number of immigrants coming over the course of the last couple decades?
Okay, so that's a complex question. So I'm going to try and take, different sentences one at a time. Okay?
We got all hour.
So this is a complex topic, as you know. There are thousands of studies, and the nuances are important here. So the first point that you made about there are jobs, right? So one of the mistakes we're making in say Borjas' work, or when people think about the adverse effects of immigration, is that if you think that there's some kind of a fixed number of jobs in the United States economy, and whenever an immigrant comes in, they take up some of those jobs, and of course you're going to see negative effects, right? But that's a very strange or unsophisticated way to think about the world. There isn't a fixed number of jobs. And that's the kind of point I was trying to make with that restaurant animation. Okay? The idea is to think about New York City versus Oslo, right? I'm picking Oslo as having relatively few immigrants, right? Think about the number of restaurants in those two cities, right? And think about the price of food or the price of restaurant meals in those two cities. They're obviously very, very different. Why are they different? Because in New York City, there's many, many immigrants who are working in the kitchen, washing dishes, etc. That allows many, many more entrepreneurs to be able to successfully run those businesses. They can actually start businesses and open up those restaurants. And that leads to a lot more business activity, a lot more meals being consumed at restaurants. That creates jobs, and importantly, it creates jobs for Americans. So again, when I was talking about client-facing skills, right? So if you want to hire a waiter or you want to hire a maitre d', right? Then you're going to think carefully about, is this a person I can put in front of my customer, right? And so the way to think about how jobs are changing is that if there are immigrant workers who are lowering the cost of operating the business, that actually creates an opportunity for entrepreneurs to hire more Americans to be client-facing.
I want to go into the idea of the rate of immigration and the overall numbers. If it's true that we don't have a magic number of jobs in the U.S., we probably need, though, to arrive at some sort of a baseline for what we might set as a target. Is there a way to calculate how much immigration over how many years is going to make the inputs into the economy such that we can be sustained and growing, and what is the tipping point at which too much immigration is too much?
I see. So I think the short answer to that is no. There is no magic formula that will tell us.
Why don't you come up with it?
Yes, and the reason is if somebody could give us a credible answer to the question that you just gave, that would be Nobel Prize worthy, right? Yeah. It's just that if any number we get, it's probably not going to be credible. And let me try to explain some of that complexity, right? And this goes back to your question about what the overall effect on the economy is. So we were talking about very simple jobs, and I already said, right? It depends on, I'm going to use in economics terms, elasticities. So it depends on, when an immigrant worker comes in, how much cheaper is the operation of the business, and therefore how many more workers can this person hire relative to how many jobs are being lost because there's some fixed constraints on the number of jobs that we created. So that itself is complex, right? But it gets even more complex beyond that because the effect of immigration is not just in taking versus creating jobs. It's also about innovation, right? So when you think about the second half of the video, right? It turns out immigrants are one of the most important contributors to innovation in the United States, right? And innovation is the sector that we do really well in. Okay? So the U.S. economy, we've been hearing a lot about trade deficits. Apparently we're losing. By the way, that also makes no sense. but that's a different story. So now U.S. economy.
But we're going to be doing so much winning. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah. So that's a separate conversation. I'm going to try not to go there. So the U.S. economy, the U.S. does have a trade deficit in virtually every sector. And the reason we have a trade deficit is that we consume a lot, and other people are happy to pay for us to consume a lot, so we're doing it, right? So that's what losing looks like. And now, if you think about where the trade deficit is narrowest, right, it's closest to a surplus, it's in high-tech sectors. Right? So the U.S. economy specializes in high-tech, it specializes in the creation of new markets, new products, and that's how jobs get created, right? It's, American consumers are quite happy getting the cheap plastic products or whatever, toys or cheap products made in China, right? But then selling back really high-end products with a lot of value added. Okay? And immigrants have a lot to do with that innovation. So just some simple numbers. More than 50% of all engineering PhDs handed out in the US over the past 20 years have been to foreign-born scientists. Okay? And many of them stay back. They start new companies, they patent new technologies, and the U.S. has been able to attract some of the most innovative people in the world. And what I'm about to say will tell you that I'm never going to run for office. So I'll just say I wasn't born here. I am an American now. America is not exceptional. Everybody talks about this is an exceptional country. We're exceptional. No country is exceptional. Why would God make one country exceptional and make everybody else second best, right? It's just that America has been able to, through its immigration policies in the past, has been able to attract exceptional people. There is exceptional people being born everywhere, right? The countries that do well are the ones that are going to be attracting them, right? And so America has done a much better job of that than Japan has, for example, right? And you see what's been happening in Japan. They've lost like 2 decades of no growth as their population's aged, and America didn't face that.
So is there some kernel, though, in that, an argument for the merit-based immigration system that some propose that say, if we bring people here who are innovators with certain job skills, we won't be displacing or driving down the wages of lower-skilled workers, but we will be bringing in people who can contribute economically at the highest possible level to keep America on that trajectory that we believe that we're on.
Okay, great. So here, what I'm about to say, some of my conservative side will come out here. And that is that, look, do we think that government bureaucrats sitting at USCIS, that they're the best at identifying talent and innovators? Probably not, right? So it's really weird that we have a Republican administration in place who wants to hand over that responsibility to a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in wherever they sit. What is our immigration policy right now? And America has a big family-based immigration policy. Okay? So, which is that, apart from these H-1B visas, which is companies, hiring people and then sponsoring them for visas, there's also American citizens who can sponsor their relatives to come to the U.S. Okay? Now, is that a problem? Is this really, the stories that you sometimes hear on, Breitbart or Fox News, et cetera, where immigrants who are coming in are a bunch of, bad people, bad hombres, murderers, et cetera, coming in? No, look, American citizens who are bringing other people in, and when they bring other people in, and I've had to do this myself, they are taking responsibility, financial responsibility for those people, right? American citizens, by and large, are sensible. They're only going to take responsibility for a set of people who they want to bring in and think that this is a good idea, right? And I think leaving it up to US citizens about who they want to bring in, there's a lot to be said for that rather than leaving it up to government bureaucrats. Okay? I wouldn't bring my loser cousin in because I'm going to have to pay for that for many, many years if I do.
I want to bring up our next, on that note, I want to bring up our next guest, someone who's involved in the process of welcoming in people into the country. Will Kneerim is Director of Employment and Education Services at Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services in New Haven. Will, come on up. And as Will's coming up, I just want to quickly show one of our other slides here. It shows that immigrants are overrepresented in the working age population. This gets back to our foundational theory for our Facing Change project at the New England News Collaborative, that the percentage of foreign-born workers is making up for the loss of people in the working age population across New England. We are very old here in New England. We are very infertile here in New England. We don't have babies. When we go to college, we often then leave and go someplace else. And so people coming from elsewhere are helping to make up the gap in most of our states. Immigrants are overrepresented in some of the region's largest industries. It's hard to see all of these industries on this graph, and I will say a nice shout out and thanks to my friend Mark Abraham and the folks at Data Haven who helped us to collect some of this data that you're seeing here. But you see that the food service industry is highly represented in a place like Massachusetts, but even in states with quite a bit less of an immigrant population, it is still quite substantial. Will, maybe you can talk a little bit about the work that you do at IRIS, first of all, just to give us a grounding in your work.
Absolutely. So we are a refugee resettlement organization here in New Haven, Connecticut. We are one of a network of 300 across the country. Just so you have some idea of the numbers, there are 65 million refugees in the world. 22 million of them have been given refugee status by the United Nations, and fewer than 1% of that group have been resettled each year for the last number of years. So America's been bringing anywhere from 60 to 100,000 refugees into America for the last number of years, and our current president set the number at a record low of 45,000 for this fiscal year, but it looks like we'll have fewer than 20,000. So this affects every organization across the country. At IRIS here in New Haven, we are comparatively lucky, if you can call it that. We resettle special immigrant visa holders from Afghanistan, many of whom work with the U.S. military. And so we are still bringing first-generation immigrants to America, right now mostly from Afghanistan and the Congo. Over the past 5 years, we have brought 300 Syrians to New Haven. Over the past 3 years, we've brought over 1,100 refugees and SIVs to the state of Connecticut, along with our organizations in Hartford, Catholic Charities, and SIRI in Bridgeport. And we see the effect it has on the economy and our society every day. Statistically and anecdotally, the answer to whether immigration is good for the U.S. economy is an unequivocal yes.
Well, I wanted to just go to the slide. This is your slide, and this is from your organization. This is a job sector breakdown. Is this of those who you resettle?
That's correct. And this little pie chart is for those who were resettled here in New Haven, Connecticut, Greater New Haven. The big blue section is not agriculture at the top of the list. It is manufacturing, which is the second to the bottom of the list. And this graph is for fiscal year 2017, so basically a year that ended at the end of January. These numbers change a lot. If you looked at this pie chart for the last 4 months, the red section for hotel work would be almost as big as the manufacturing section is here. And that is very simply because U.S. Surgical, which is now Medtronics in North Haven, stopped hiring many of our skilled Afghan immigrants. And so there was a dearth of jobs in the manufacturing industry, and all of a sudden we were able to fill the hotel industry with many jobs, especially as Yale graduation and other events in this area started happening in April and May. So it changes all the time. But I would like to add that our refugee and SIV clients who take these jobs are not all uneducated workers. Some of them come perhaps with limited English, but with master's degrees. And so when we talk to employers, in a sense, we feel we are selling the skills and the characteristics of our clients, and it is easy to explain the truth, which is their English will only get better. Their job skills will only improve. So we see clients time and again who come, work a 40, 50-hour-a-week job, take classes at Gateway on the side, move up to UNH or another university, get a degree, improve their salaries, and we see their kids going to Ivy League schools and some of the best schools in the country, and that's the story of America for 300 years.
I'm wondering, Mushfiq, if you might just pick up on that a bit, because what Will is saying is something that we see all the time. It's people who are coming with advanced degrees, with specialties that they might not be able to work in immediately, but putting those job skills to work. So as an economist, I mean, how do you account for that? It's one thing to say, I've got an agricultural worker in Central America who's going to come and do agricultural work here, but it's another thing to say, I have a doctor or a psychologist who is going to come work at a hotel here. I'm wondering how we account for that economic input.
So it is absolutely the case that many of these workers who are coming in, I shouldn't call them workers, refugees who are coming in, thanks to Iris's excellent work, they are going to be underemployed here, right? But you see a lot of benefits of having high educated parents, which is, for example, the children get high educated, right? And then the next generation succeeds. Okay? So just to give you a personal example, because it connects Iris and what we were talking about, the intergenerational consequences here, talking about. So yeah, I came from a poor family in a poor country in Bangladesh. Now, my daughter, who's sitting right there, so she's 13 now, but when she was 11 years old, ran a wonderful drive for Iris resettled refugees, and you guys needed alarm clocks, blankets.
Thank
you. And in fact, this is also a story about how generous Connecticut is. That after she ran the drive and in her school, and there was lots and lots of donations, for the next 6 months, we kept it in our garage because it turns out Iris got so many donations thanks to all the generous people of Connecticut that they didn't have need for this for at least a few months. And so that's, you see this also, like if you just turn on the TV and watch the spelling bee or the geography bee, right? There is a dearth of real Americans who are who are competing at these, and it comes down to the fact that why are we seeing that? Look, we want to we want to attract the most exceptional people, right? And the act of immigration, leaving your family behind, taking risk, right? Those are the same characteristics that positively predict taking risk in starting businesses, being entrepreneurial, etc. And then you see that many of the high-performing companies that create lots and lots of jobs in the U.S. turn out to be started by immigrants.
But obviously, when people are coming here, especially as refugees will, it's not obvious that they will find these jobs easily, despite these skills, these qualifications, this talent and drive that they bring. So walk us through some of the difficulties and the challenges that you face in finding work for folks who are coming for the first time.
Well, there are myriad challenges, and John, it's really based on the types of backgrounds and the language, English language level that so many of our clients have. So a couple of disparate examples. An educated client, perhaps like an Afghan SIV who learned superb English and developed a skill while working for the U.S. Army abroad, will come here expecting quite a lot economically, having earned quite a lot from the U.S. military during the boom years in Kabul of a few years ago. And it's shocking to that person to find out that the best job available might be 20 hours a week at minimum wage stocking shelves at Walmart. And that's depressing and overwhelming when you have 3 young children and a wife who perhaps doesn't speak a word of English and never had the opportunity to go to school. What a tough situation to be thrown into at the beginning. However, in increments of 3, 6, 9, 12 months, we see such incredible progress. That mother is in a Mommy and Me English class so that her child is getting early learning help and getting prepared for a preschool or a daycare program in the U.S., while the mother is learning English, which is really family literacy. She's learning how to go to this shopping mall and the grocery store and figuring out how to speak to her kids' teachers. And a year later, that husband is no longer saying, yes, I'd like my wife at home cooking and taking care of the kids. He is saying, this is a tough country to live in. I need everybody in my family to contribute whatever they can. So that, that's a typical example of many of our educated clients. The struggle at first, but slow and steady progress. We have other clients who never had education in their home countries and may never learn to have much above a minimum wage income. However, invariably, they say they are coming for their children. And so once they are placed in a job that will pay the rent, we find that they often make friends. They have circles of friends that really change their lives here in New Haven and around the state.
And in just a moment, I'm going to bring up a reporter I've been working with on many of these stories, because these personal stories are so important. But I think what Will just said reminded me of a study that I wanted to talk to you about, Mushfiq, and it has to do with immigration over time. Some reporting that we did around some studies that have been done in recent years show that the first generation immigrants, the people who come, as you say, with maybe not so many language skills, they're going to have a little bit of a tougher time, and they're going to actually cost a little bit more in terms of our output as a society, right? They're going to take a bit as they get on their feet. But what's interesting is what happens to the second generation, and I'm wondering if you can tell that story a little bit. It's fascinating.
Sure. Actually, we don't even have to wait for the second generation. Earlier when we were talking about the effects on the economy, we covered effects on jobs and wages. We covered effects on maybe innovation and job and employment generation, right? But the third effect that economists worry a lot about is fiscal effects, right? So how much are immigrants taking out of the system relative to how much they're putting in, right? And again, that same National Academy of Sciences panel reviewed the dozens of studies that look at these fiscal effects, and what they find is, yes, the first few years, I think maybe statistically the first 4 to 7 years, right? Immigrants do on average, take out more from the system, like more in benefits than they pay in taxes, right? But that sign switches 8th year onwards, and it stays positive thereafter, right? So that's a story that doesn't, you don't even need to wait till the second generation. But to add to that story, what accentuates that effect is that, as I said, if immigrants are positively selected, their children, on average, turn out to be high performers. Partly because, that's the type of family they've come from. That's the type of parents who've, selected to come into this country, right? And they, on average, do well, and therefore they then contribute much more to the economy than they take out of it.
And not just more to the economy than they take out, but that second generation immigrant contributes more to the U.S. economy than the median American, than I do, right? And that's something that's really quite remarkable. It's that they jump above the line of what we'll say the typical American who is concerned about losing his or her job.
Yeah. To be fair, you're not the median American, but but yes, the point is generally valid.
It's a whole different show, I think.
But let me also point out, I want to be careful about pointing something else out, because now the conversation we're having across Will and me is that we're talking about two different populations. I've been focused on the economic effects of immigration. I'm almost thinking about immigrants as a bunch of working robots, right? Whereas Will is talking about a very different population of refugees, and the reasons for us to support refugees, bring them in, give them a home, is very different, and it exists regardless of their economic characteristics, right? There is also a humanitarian urgency. There's a moral imperative for us to be supporting refugees.
Yeah, our refugee clients are a tiny subset of immigrants around the country and here in Connecticut. But I know that same study. I think it was Pew Research that talked about refugees who are 18 to 49 contributing more to the economy after 7 or 8 years than they've taken out. And it's terrible to think of a human being as just an economic plus or minus. However, our clients do receive health care for 8 months. We help them sign up for social services. So I think it's incredible that people who come without English are actually contributing financially to the economy within 7 or 8 years. And just another statistic or two about New Haven. Our clients who are searching for work when they arrive find their first job within 3 months, about 40% of the time. Within 4 months, almost 70% of the time. And within 6 months, over 90% of our clients have found their first job. The fire is lit under refugees and many immigrants. The need to succeed economically is so dire and pressing that it pushes people. And the change that you see in the first few months in the country is stunning.
And we hear a lot about vetting and the need for additional vetting to make sure that we don't bring in criminals, right? But the vetting process that refugees have to go through in order to come into this country is just incredible. It's
the most carefully vetted immigrants in the history of the world. They go through about 2 years of United Nations background checks and biometrics, and then once they've been assigned to a certain country like the US CIS, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security also does thorough background checks. So we never have a problem with any of our clients passing a background check when they're offered a job.
And just to put in perspective, sorry that I'm talking back and forth, put in perspective, how much the U.S. is contributing. So as Will already mentioned, we're at a historic low in terms of taking in refugees. There are countries where, such as Lebanon, Jordan, right, and we were talking about Syrian refugees, where, like Lebanon, over 10% of the entire Lebanese population is now Syrian refugees. And Bangladesh, which is a poor country, the one I come from, within the last 12 months, took in over 700,000 Rohingya refugees who were facing genocide in Burma, in Myanmar.
I want to turn to Shannon Dooling. She's a reporter for WBUR in Boston. She's been working with me for the last couple of years on the New England News Collaborative on this project called Facing Change. And she's been reporting on all sorts of immigration issues. And I think she's going to maybe bring us some of these personal stories that help connect the dots of some of what we've been talking about. Come on up, Shannon. And she braved the traffic coming down from Boston, so thank you. So you've been covering immigration for several years now, and you've been writing about Haitians and Hondurans with temporary protected status and many high-profile immigration cases and a lot of other just real personal stories. I guess one thing I wonder is when you talk to people who are coming from other countries, why did many of them come to the U.S. in the first place?
It's probably not a surprise that the reasons vary tremendously. And one thing that I'm not sure we've addressed yet is the differentiation between quote unquote legal immigration and illegal immigration, or people who are coming here without authorization, right? Without visas or without refugee status. And my work gratefully spans the spectrum. So I get to meet a lot of people who are coming from a lot of really different backgrounds. Many have been refugees who have found themselves resettled here in the US, which is not an easy feat. As a refugee, for many of the reasons we've discussed. Some of them, maybe are on a different type of visa. Maybe they have what you mentioned, temporary protected status, or TPS. You've probably seen a little bit of that in the news lately. And others made their way here in sort of the traditional immigrant tale, which is, I came here to make a better life for my family. I found a job. I brought my son. He found a job. He brought his family. And before you know it, you have really vibrant communities, many of which we saw in some of these charts do thrive in places like New Haven and communities in Connecticut and especially in Massachusetts. So it really, really varies, I'd say, the experiences of people.
In a minute, I actually want to turn to Mushfiq and get a bit more detail about that impact of what we call illegal immigration, because that's such a big part of the conversation, and we almost can't talk about immigration without that being the headline. And that's one of the reasons I think I didn't want to start with it.
Sorry.
Because there's so much, but I think that's an important piece of it. Though I know you were going to present a couple of stories that you've told, and one really has to do with this thing we brought up before, having to do with the various sectors that are so important to our economy here, specifically the healthcare economy, and what that means to this aging population.
Right. So having reported on a lot of this over the last few years, I can't sort of overemphasize the startling effect that these numbers have when you're kind of up to your eyeballs in them for a few weeks, and hearing the sort of like almost, I don't know, I don't want to like scare anyone, but when you talk to economists and to labor specialists about what the sort of future of some of these industries look like in much of New England, it's not that pretty. And so it's something that we have to be sort of actively addressing and thinking about. Specifically with healthcare, one of the reasons we've mentioned, we're very aging, we're white, and we're not having a lot of children in New England. In all of the states, I think Massachusetts has done a really good job of retaining young people. Connecticut as well, but overall, to an extent, yeah. But I mean, you know, before I digress, I have literally seen posters on the T in Boston from the state of Maine advertising. You know, it says seeking wanderlusters to live and work in Maine, and there's a photo of a young woman sitting on this pristine mountaintop, and it's kind of like, why live in the city when you can have a job and go hiking and live in Maine? And by the way, like, hopefully you're 20 and you'll stay here. And that's what, you know, Vermont, I'm sure some of you saw a headline recently, Vermont is incentivizing people to move there and telecommute if need be. They're offering up to $10,000 for I just saw these two people look at one another like, hey, sorry, that was great. To move there, and they'll pay for like your broadband, your internet and whatnot. But healthcare for sure is one of the largest, most sort of immediate needs. And I think first we'll hear a bit of sound from this lovely woman, Ayu Laku, who actually I met when I was reporting one of these stories. She was in a classroom full of immigrants from, I think they ran the gamut from, she's Ethiopian. I met a woman from Haiti, from El Salvador, from the Dominican Republic, from the Congo, all sitting in the same classroom, essentially. And the name of the course that they were in is Working with Frail Elders. And the course was offered at Jewish Vocational Services in Boston. She came to the country on what's called a diversity visa, which, does that exist any longer? Yeah, right? No, we got rid of that. Yeah, the Trump administration eliminated the diversity visa. Or they're talking about it. I'm not sure if it... Yeah, it hasn't been eliminated yet, but it's something that's sort of on the chopping block. So anyway, let's hear a little bit about what her experience has been like since she came to Boston.
It was good. I like it.
What do you like about it?
You know, I don't have experience before, but I want to be like nursing in the future. This is a good start for me. Before I got my baby, I used to work in the parking place. Yeah. You can see me like after 5 registered nursing. I'm going to be like full-time nursing. This is good to start to have good bridge for registered nursing.
So she's saying she's in this course titled How to Work with Frail Elders, and she's already thinking about, in 5 years, I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to be an RN, and come back and check in with me in 5 years. So I've come across a lot of really remarkable stories like that.
And I remember when you were playing that tape for me, she said something about, I worked in the parking place. So she spent some time working at a parking garage when she first arrived. Yeah,
and it's one of those industries, I guess you would say, in Boston where, someone gets a job and they get their cousin a job. And so you tend to see a lot of people who are family members even working in something like a parking garage where they take your ticket, and she's, actively seeking to gain skills that are desperately needed in this region.
I know that in that same story, you actually talked with an economist about some of these numbers, and this chart that we put on our story actually tells a little bit of the story about home care workers and nursing assistants. Once again, these are the people who are taking care of all of us aging New Englanders.
Right. So we're living longer, which is great, but who's going to take care of us? And I think what this chart sort of suggests is that we're going to be depending more and more on foreign-born workers to do that. Barry Bluestone is a really dynamic professor of public policy at Northeastern University, and I'm going to let this particular piece of tape speak for itself, really.
Massachusetts, we project we're going to need about 93,000 additional home care workers over the next 10 years, or almost 10,000 a year. These are overwhelmingly immigrant workers, and what I fear is if the current kind of political environment either shuts off immigration or potential immigrants look at the United States and say this is not a very comfortable or safe place to be, I don't have any idea how we're going to fill those 10,000 jobs each year.
Those are huge numbers, and that's in Massachusetts.
That's just Massachusetts, yeah.
And so, well, let's talk about the two pieces of that, Mushfiq. So there's policy that may change and may limit the number of people, like the woman from Ethiopia we just saw, who are able to enter the United States. But then there's that overwhelming worry that people have about whether or not America is a welcoming place for immigrants. Talk about that impact and what you see coming down the pike.
So I really appreciate these numbers. I'm going to make some anecdotes along with some numbers. So my wife is moving up the skill chain a little bit. She's also an immigrant from the Cayman Islands, and she's a physical therapist, right? And there's incredible demand in the healthcare sector just because we are an aging population. So many of her colleagues, when she was working at hospitals, were from, say, the Philippines. So many nurses and physical therapists were from the Philippines. And now so let me first respond to this question about is this a welcoming place? And maybe later on we can also touch on the illegal immigration issue. So I think the most lasting damage that I'm very worried about this country, given what's happening in the country today, is that if this current administration is successful in relaying to the world or conveying this idea that this is not a welcoming place for you, right? And then what happens is that, as I was saying earlier, why we have succeeded over the last many decades or centuries is that we have been the most welcoming place for talented people, a lot of talented people initially from Europe and then from other parts of the world, all agglomerated here, right? And this country became successful. And if somehow, we now start conveying the message that we don't want you, this is not a place for you, then a lot of those talented people are going to end up somewhere else, in Australia, perhaps in Europe, elsewhere. And that's going to not show up immediately, but it's going to show up as 20 years down the road with less innovation happening, right? So if Google, the next Google doesn't get started in the United States and instead it gets started in Germany or in Australia, that's going to be the big cost for us, right? And that's the lasting damage that we should all be really, really worried about, right? That's like the only thing I can think of that's as big and lasting an impact as, say, starting a war in Iraq that kills millions of people and costs us $1 trillion for no good reason.
Will, do you have a thought on this about the impact of just the feeling of whether or not America is a welcoming place to immigrants in terms of some of the questions we're trying to answer today?
I think there are many ways to answer that question. It's certainly a welcoming place here in Connecticut. And in other pockets of New England and in other parts of the country, it's welcoming thanks to church groups, civic groups, refugee organizations like ours, other immigrant support groups like Junta here in New Haven. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. Shannon was talking about a number of different types of immigrants, undocumented immigrants. We sometimes serve them as well. If someone is without documents, they can, of course, apply for asylum. And if the court case is not adjudicated within 6 months, they can get a work permit. It's getting harder and more expensive to apply for asylum, but it's one path. And we find in communities throughout this state and New England, groups of people like yourselves who are interested, knowledgeable, and want to help immigrants achieve not only a legal status here in the country, but the job and the successful life they're seeking.
I'll disagree a little bit here, in the sense that when we are thinking about the long-term implications for innovation and for growth in this country, right? We have to be thinking about what is the perception of, say, the IIT, Indian Institute of Technology graduate, which is one of the most difficult to get into programs in the world, right? When they're thinking about applying to a PhD program, is their perception that if I go to MIT, I'm going to be harassed along the way, right? That there's not going to be visa category such that I'm able to start a business or get high quality employment afterwards, relative to, if I were to go to Cambridge University or the University of Sydney, right? That's the kind of worry we need to have. That those types of perceptions is what really matters. If on the margin talented people start making decisions that they haven't made. So one of the most successful exports from the United States is higher education, right? Just in terms of the raw numbers of the dollars generated in terms of tuition revenue, but also in terms of the main mechanism through which the most talented people come here.
I want to turn back to this question of people who are here without documentation. I know that it's been a big part of your reporting, and one of the things that you've followed is not just individuals who are here who have some very harrowing personal stories that we've heard at some great length through our reporting, but also families that have mixed immigration status and how difficult that can be.
Yeah, so it's often referred to as mixed status households. They are very common. And let me give you an example. So let's say mom and dad came to the U.S. through different channels. Maybe dad, in the family that we're thinking about right now, I'll give you their sort of portfolio. The mother and father fled from Guatemala. And I say fled because the father was involved in sort of civil unrest and had been targeted and received death threats. His wife was previously to starting her relationship with the father of these boys. She was in a very dangerous domestic violence situation with a previous partner. And so she ultimately fled that and came to the U.S. to meet up with her new partner. This is a picture of the Macario family. So the four sons of these two people we're talking about right now. 3 of them are U.S.-born citizens. 1 of them is not. He came to the country without authorization to meet up with his mom and dad. And the thing about this image that always strikes me is that I can't tell who's who. I can't tell which one is a U.S. citizen and which one's not. And but on paper, it's and according to the U.S. government, there are some distinct differences there. So Isidro Macario is the eldest. He was born in Guatemala. He is farthest to the right. And in February, he was deported back to Guatemala. I was there at the airport at Logan International at 6 a.m. with his immigration attorney, with one of his brothers, and it was quite a dramatic scene. I mean, you're literally, regardless of where you stand on policy, you're watching siblings being separated and not knowing when or how or if they're going to reunite. So let's hear from Isidro. He talks here a little bit about what living in a mixed status household has meant for him.
It's very tough for myself and also for my family because we've been struggling with this for so many years, and instead of getting better, it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and we just nobody understands probably our pain.
Nobody understands our pain was that last sentence. That was a hard story to witness.
And we hear from another one of the brothers here, right?
We do, yeah. We hear from Saul, who so Isidro is 28 or was at the time of this story. His next eldest brother is 21. Saul, and we'll hear from him in just a second. And then the youngest is closest to the screen in the gray sweatshirt. He's 16, and in the corner there is Anthony. He's 18. So 2 of the U.S. citizen brothers were in high school. We can talk about that in a minute, but let's listen first to Saul describe what this has been like for him.
When I see it taking them one by one, that's how I see it. The first it was my dad, then my mom, my brother.
So he's saying that taking them one by one.
Right. He says, first it was my dad, then my mom, then my brother. And what he means by that is maybe a year or two before Isidro was deported this past February, his father was also deported back to Guatemala after, I believe he had applied for asylum and did not win his asylum case. He was saying that he did have a fear, what's called a fear of credible return, of going back to his home country because of his involvement in sort of anti-government stances. That wasn't approved. They've not heard from him since then. They've had very little to no communication with him. They're not sure where he is within Guatemala. Their mother, who is also in the country without authorization, is currently, since January, has been seeking shelter in a church in Greater Boston while she waits to hear about her asylum application. And you'll remember that she has a pretty serious background with a domestic violence encounter or repeated domestic violence.
The reason that we wanted to present this story is, in some ways, it sounds like a lot of the stories that we've told over the course of the last couple of years. You've been at Logan Airport a couple times to watch people be deported. You've been to courthouses several times to watch people fight for their chance to stay in the United States, and in some cases not be deported back to a place. I'm thinking of another story, El Salvador, where someone could very easily face death as soon as he arrives. But there is an economic imperative to this as well, and you got at it before, and it has to do with what this has done to these young men. Can you talk about that and how this relates to our conversation about the economy?
Yeah. It's I think, maybe a little forward-thinking, a little nuanced, and a little abstract compared to some of the things we've been discussing, but that's sort of like the realm that I like to live in. So I think what my takeaway is that, so the three youngest brothers, all U.S. citizens, U.S.-born citizens, the 21-year-old had sort of accepted the fact that he was now going to be the primary breadwinner for his family of three. He said, I'll pick up, a couple extra shifts. I'm going to try to do my best to be the father figure. The 18-year-old was going to pick up some extra shifts at McDonald's where he worked in a Boston suburb, and also, try to make it through his senior year of high school. And the 16-year-old in the gray sweatshirt didn't want to talk at all. He just was. It was kind of like if he wasn't talking about it, it wasn't happening. And so he said he doesn't really talk about it that much with friends or with anyone at school. I've kept in touch with the family and with Isidro, who's in Guatemala. He, interestingly, tells me that he's ready to come back to the U.S. and by any means necessary. The 18-year-old and 16-year-old have failed out of high school, and the 21-year-old is trying to sort of keep it all together. But so what I keep thinking about, what John and I have discussed, is sort of here we have, three U.S.-born citizens, and according to politics and policy, we've made a very clear line to differentiate them from their brother. And we've not given them much hope or motivation to become, productive members of our community or our society. It's really all they can do to just kind of keep it together and be there for one another. So I'll let you maybe, or the rest of the panel, kind of do the calculations as to what that might mean for economic productivity. But to me, it means we have some disenfranchised and isolated citizens that are going to be part of a whole new generation, really.
Do you have a thought on that, Mushfiq? Because that is a nuanced, difficult thing to measure. It's different than some of the statistics we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, I think all of this highlights that the immigration policy system is just completely broken. Right? I mean, we have an arbitrary set of rules. Okay, I mean, we need rules for sure. You know, if we were sitting in a room like this in a very different state, we'd hear about, you know, laws are important. You know, people who are coming, you know, who are standing in line using legal means, they should receive priorities, etc. Right? Now, okay, let me give you some different type of data to explain, you know, in what way fundamentally the system is broken. So you observe, you know, we can measure or infer immigration patterns, both in migration as well as immigration out of the U.S., right, over time as the U.S. goes through periods of booms or recessions, right? And what you see is that during recessions, when jobs aren't available, you actually see net negative migration from south of the border. And that's sensible because immigrants, like the rest of us, are sensible people, right? They're here for economic reasons. They want jobs. If jobs aren't available, they'd go back home, right? And so the decisions that they're making, you know, in economics is a really important concept of, is it distorted? Are there distortions we're introducing, right? Like, you know, so splitting up families like this is, of course, a distortion that has long-term consequences when kids fail out of school, and so they're not going to be productive citizens in the future, right? But so when you hear economists talk, or you hear, you know, either the left or the right side of the aisle talk, they talk about, you know, we need free movement of capital, we need free movement of goods, we want to reduce trade barriers, right? Well, countries that have distortions in the flow of capital, right, they do very, very poorly, right? Think about, say, countries like Zimbabwe has immense distortion of capital, right? But the economic logic behind free, you know, labor migration is just another factor of production, just like capital is, right? If you're a conservative and you believe in the free movement of capital, like most conservatives do, the economic logic behind free movement of people and labor is no different at all, right? The mathematics are exactly the same.
Is there, however, some distinction that we can make between the productivity, getting back to some of our earlier slides and some of your earlier commentary, of people who come here without documentation, people who, in some people's minds, jump the line, versus those who come through a different process? Is there some way to gauge that?
So, you know, when we are thinking about the economic consequences, the growth consequences of this, right? We want people to be making sensible decisions based on push and pull factors as to where they'll be most productive, right? And if we remove barriers, people are going to move to where they're going to be most productive. If it just so happened that my skill was much more productive in a different country, I would move out of here in a heartbeat, right? That's true for most of us. You know, if you get a better job offer, given your set of skills, you move somewhere else, right? And so having any sort of barrier, which then creates, you know, a barrier means that we have a set of rules, and then when we have a set of rules, some people will break them because of those economic pull and push factors, right? And when they break them, then we start talking about legality, and there's an illegal class, there's a legal class, and rules matter, etc. Right? These are all distortions that just make all human beings worse off. So an economist calculated that the aggregate global cost of having these barriers. By the way, it's not just the U.S. Many countries have entry barriers, right? And the title of the paper is $trillion bills left on the sidewalk. So, you know, the second economist joke about, you know, what do you do if you see a $20 bill on the sidewalk? And economists would never go down to pick it up. Why? Because if that really was a $20 bill, somebody would have picked it up already. So, you know, arbitrage, right? It would have been arbitraged away, right? And we are actually, you know, with these barriers, we are leaving aside like $1 trillion bills that could be arbitraged away and create increases in global productivity.
Will, did you have a quick thought?
Well, just thinking of this family of four brothers, what an economic mistake. First, we're spending time and financial resources removing one brother from the country, which of course affects the three remaining brothers. 40% of the small businesses in America are started by first-generation immigrants. You know, one of those brothers could have started a taco cart that could have turned into something enormous. And when you rob people of the opportunity to do that sort of thing by splitting up families, and you spend money doing that, it's a double negative that is hurting us across the region and the country.
Actually, since you said that, we had one last slide here about self-employment. Immigrants are self-employed in many of the fields that we rely on every day. So you see the numbers there, and this is a part of the stories that you cover as well, Shannon. I want to play a piece of tape from our show next, in which we look at the impact of immigration on remaking small towns. But I know you've covered a number of the struggling cities in Massachusetts that have been trying to remake themselves with an enormous amount of immigrant labor coming into existing businesses, but also starting businesses along the way.
Yeah, I think about Lawrence and some of the so-called gateway cities that we have in Massachusetts, which is kind of a fancy way of describing cities that are at certain demographic and economic metrics, right? So think of a lot of the sort of old mill towns, Lawrence, Lowell, Fitchburg, where, maybe they were making paper, or, they were producing some product. And that was, guess who was working in those mills? It was Irish immigrants and Lithuanian immigrants and Europeans, right? And so now, one story in particular that I'm thinking about was in Lawrence, and was talking about how this old mill building, this beautiful brick building, had been renovated, and the basement of the building, or the bottom floor of the building, was occupied by what's called Entrepreneurship for All. And the goal for this group is to match ideas with funding, and to do it, for most of the time first-generation immigrants, people from high school students to maybe, the brother who has an idea to start a taco shop. And so the sort of poetic justice of that was not lost on me, where we were in this building that was built, most likely with immigrant labor and filled with immigrants. And here we are sort of renovating it and realizing the power of entrepreneurship in a very new economy right now, right? So,
one of the stories that we've covered, it takes place in a city not terribly unlike some of the towns that Shannon's talking about. It's a place called Lewiston, Maine. From 2001 to 2011, about 7,000 immigrants from Africa came to Lewiston. It's a city that formerly had a population of 36,000 and was 96% Caucasian. So just think about that for a second. So it's 36,000 people in town. It's almost all white people. And 7,000 people from Somalia descend on this community over the course of about 10 years. So we spoke with Amy Bass. She's the author of a book called One Goal, A Coach, a Team, and the Game That Brought a Divided Town Together. This was on my show Next back in March. The reason that you're looking at a group of soccer players here is that the thing that allowed this town to accept these immigrants wasn't some of what you're going to hear Amy talk about. It wasn't the economic benefits that they brought. It wasn't the vibrancy to the community. It was the fact that they were really, really good at soccer. So good at soccer that it allowed the Lewiston high school soccer team to win the state title for the first time in its history. And as often happens in America, we rally around immigrants. We rally around others when they bring specific skills that help us do the thing that we want to do. Anyway, the upshot of that for our conversation is a bit of what happened to the town of Lewiston. Let's listen to Amy.
Heyday of the textile factories, back when Lewiston was called Spindle City. Lisbon Street, Lewiston, it was the largest retail area outside of Boston in New England. And slowly that began to disappear as the factories closed because, workers are shoppers, and when workers are unemployed, they are no longer shoppers. So now you're starting to see that come back. I'm stunned when I walk down Lisbon Street in Lewiston. I'm stunned by the global flavor. It's always been a very French city because of the French-Canadian mill workers. And now it's got all of this other amazing, vibrant stuff, halal meat markets and the clothes that are being sold, these little mom and pop shops. They are exactly what Lewiston, I think, hoped for. I don't think anyone imagined that this is what it was going to look like. So all of these things are part of this transformation. And it's partly the Somali, coming into the city, and it's also a lot of hard work in terms of the city strategizing and figuring things out.
Again, that's Amy Bass, and it's a remarkable book. It's the last story that I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to ask is if you had any questions for our panelists. We have a couple folks with microphones on each side of these very, very steep stairs. So if you hold up your hand and you'd like to ask a question, we can get you a microphone. Does anybody have a question or a thought? I'll continue to. Do we have one down front? We'll scan the audience here and see if anybody has any thought. But I wanted to sort of put that Lewiston question to you, Mushfiq, because there's the transformation of a place that looked one way, it felt one way, it was one way for a very long time. And this isn't an influx of immigration over the course of 10 or 20 years or 30. This isn't a trickle of a few people who speak a different language coming into town. This is a complete change of a community. And it presents an interesting test case for some of the things we're talking about the economic impact, but also the social ability to accept people from elsewhere into your community.
Right. And this actually, this reminded me of a couple of things where it has played out in larger scale. So we were talking about, the community being very happy about the soccer performance. Now, this week, the World Cup soccer tournament starting, and the defending champions, Germany, who are playing, won the World Cup 4 years ago with a team of immigrants who were born or their parents were born in Ghana, in Turkey, in Poland, etc. So it also works out well for countries as a whole. And then the other story is that we've actually studied cases like this because this type of a shock is really useful for empirical researchers to see what does happen when there's a large inflow of migration. That's where we're most likely to see these wage changes, right? And those are the types of cases we think about. And then the Mariel boat lift from Cuba is one famous such case. And an economist by the name of David Card, who's at UC Berkeley, he studied the effect, and it's one of the most famous papers in labor economics. And that was one of the first surprising results, that even with such a large inflow of migration from Cuba into southern Florida, right? And he had detailed data on wage changes in southern Florida, and it turns out there are no detectable effects, partly because of these opposing factors that I talked about, job creation versus taking jobs away, right? And one other point I'll make about these large influxes is that, yes, absolutely, then there are potentially a lot of social effects which we haven't covered, right? I've been focused on the economic effects, and it's definitely very important for us to get a more holistic understanding of what the effect of immigration is, to understand the cities or the town's absorptive capacity, not just in an economic sense, but in these other senses.
I want to, before we thank our panelists, I want to thank Lily Tyson, who produced today's program. A nice round of applause for Lily. Thank you to Mushfiq Mobarak, to Will Kneerim, and to Shannon Dooling. And thanks once again to the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. Thank you.